All right, today we're going to be doing a little bit of Dart on the back end. I really love Dart, and I also really love doing stuff server side. Usually, as of recently, I'm working in Python on the back, but I've been playing around with Dart a bit more and more, and really enjoying it. And it's cool to take the experience I have from Flutter and kind of apply it to sort of another world. So we're going to be building a URL shortener, which is a pretty basic thing to build, but it kind of will cover a lot of the different topics that you would need in any backend, because we are going to be building an API. This will be sort of like a headless project that will run that, you know, maybe your Flutter app can talk to directly, or another web framework, really anything can talk to it, because it's just going to be a RESTful API. But yeah, that's what we're going to build. And in order to follow along, these are the things you'll need. You'll need Dart, obviously. We're going to be using something called Dart Frog, which we'll look into in a bit, kind of for the actual server and HTTP requests. We'll be using Docker and Postgres. And then I am going to be using something called pgadmin. Technically, you don't need it, or you can use any other database tool, DataGrip, or anything really, or just the command line if you're really familiar with PSQL, but it's a little more visual to use something like pgadmin. We're going to have Postman, just so we can actually play with the endpoints without actually building a Flutter app to go along with it. And I will be showing also how we can deploy this to, in this example, use Heroku, but because we will be using Docker, you know, the sky's kind of the limit. You should be able to host it really anywhere. We're going to start by sort of setting up the project, installing Dart Frog, installing Docker, initializing our project, setting up the way we want to handle our configuration, especially configuration between our local environment and our actual production cloud-based environment. And we're going to just test connecting to Postgres. Then we're going to start making some stuff. We'll make our link model, which will essentially be something that handles you know, the short code that gets generated, as well as where the URL needs to redirect to. And we'll need to create a database table to save those to and persist them. We'll create our basic CRUD, you know, being able to create these links and read from them. And although we're not going to really worry about updating, because these are going to kind of be a one time you create, they won't be able to be, they'll be immutable. And we're also not going to worry about deleting. So we're really just going to be doing our CR part of CRUD. We're going to make some endpoints to be able to generate these, and we need to set up a redirect. So when someone actually comes from a link that was generated, how do we redirect them to the right place? And that'll be most of it, but we'll have a little more fun, and we'll do some click tracking. We'll allow people to create custom shortcodes, and also add in some functionality so that we can have reusable links. Meaning if someone pastes the same link in, rather than having a second entry in our database with a different shortcode, we can reuse the same shortcode. And then we'll look into actually hosting this somewhere. You're getting it up on the cloud, in this case Heroku, but because we'll be using Docker, again, it will kind of translate to many different hosting providers. All right, so that's the overview, and let's get into it. So we're going to be using something called Dart Frog. There's other options too. This is made by the Very Good company, which they have some really good things on Flutter and Dart. And it's basic, it's simple, and it does exactly what we want, just to kind of get something started. So in order to actually get this up and running, you can just go to you can search Dart Frog. Now you'll find by searching Dart Frog, you'll probably come across the frog itself. So just add the word dev or something, or you can hit this URL here. So in order to install it, we obviously need Dart already. So I'm just assuming you have Dart, but let us just run Dart pub global activate Dart Frog CLI, and it is installed. And from wherever we want to actually make the project, we just run now Dart Frog, Dart_frog, create. And we'll call this URL Shortener, very fancy name. Okay, now we can cd into that and open it up in VS Code. Okay, from here, let's just get some dependencies installed. So first of all, we need to have Postgres. We are going to be using a Postgres database. So in order to do that, similar to installing packages in Flutter, we can run, instead of Flutter, Dart pub add, and then the package name, and it will be Postgres in this case. And if we look at our pub spec now, we will see Postgres, the latest one, has been installed. And then I also want another package called .env, and this is just going to let us manage our environment variables. All right, we are off to a good start. So let's actually just get this up and running, and we can do that by running Dart frog dev. And this will start the development server on port 8080. So I can click that and open it, and we'll see welcome to Dart frog. So let's just explore and see kind of how this works. If we go into our routes folder, this follows sort of the principles that things like Next.js and a lot of these JavaScript meta frameworks are doing, where your routes is a folder and you actually just put files in them. And your routing, you don't actually have like a router, it's all like a file-based routing system. So you can see in here there's an on request, and we are just sending, welcome to Dart frog, and I'm just going to add some exclamation marks here. And we'll see it automatically hot reloads, which is great, but we will have to refresh in the browser to make the new request, and we'll see the change was made here. Now, just speaking about routing, we can also make a file called test.dart, and I'm just going to copy everything here, and we'll just change this to say test. And so the routing, because that was called index, we didn't actually have to have the word index, but now we can do /test, and we'll actually get routed to that. So that's one option for doing it. Another way we could do this exact same thing is actually make a folder called test, and inside of it, we would then rename this to index. And from Dart frog's point of view, this should reflect exactly the same. We get test. So it's just file-based routing, pretty basic. Now say we wanted to have a URL parameter. What we could do inside, let's say, our test folder is let's actually rename this, and essentially you give it a sort of a funny name. It's basically square bracket ... and then we'll just call it param. It can be really anything, but we do that. And now, if we go into this param.dart, there's actually a second argument we would put in called string param. There'll always be strings, at least at first. And what we can actually do is print that now. So I'm just going to save this. This specific thing, I'm showing it because it will come very much in handy when we get into our dynamic links. Now, sometimes when you do sort of like a file name change and whatever, you may run into issues and you might have to fully restart your server. The hot reload might not work, but let's just see. So in this case, we'd be going into the test folder and then typing in really any word that we want. So let's just do like foobar, and we'll get test foobar. So it's basically passing whatever's in this URL as this first argument here, which then we can access. So as you can probably tell, that's going to come in handy for doing a URL shortener, where we don't want to make a file for every single URL that someone generates. That would be ridiculous and wouldn't really work. So that allows us to do that. So that's kind of like routing in a nutshell. Okay, so let's get our Postgres stuff set up and our configuration. So the first thing I want to do here is I'm going to make a source folder just to start putting all of our lovely custom code in. And let's actually make a file in the correct spot. We'll call it config.dart. And in our config.dart, we're just going to create a class to sort of manage different things. So I'm just going to call it config. And we're going to have a reference to our .env environment here. Now, I'm going to make that late because we don't actually have access to it yet. And I'm going to import this in. This was one of the two packages we installed, the .env. And in our constructor here, we are just going to simply call an init function. And our init function will be, oops, we have to actually name it something. We'll call it init. And we want to essentially set this environment here. So we're going to go environment equals, and we load it in .env, and we want to go .load. And this will look for a .env file somewhere in our project. Now, something that's important is because we're not going to have an env file on our server when we do this. We're going to want to rely on the actual environment variable set by the operating system. So we're going to add a parameter here, include platform environment, true, so that those files actually kind of get combined, our parameters. Also, this can be a const. Wait, no, it can't. Okay. Oh, it's just because so Dart frog, just so you know why you might be getting like different warning messages than you're used to, which I got a little bit surprised about. I was like, why am I getting all these? In the analysis options, you actually see it's using the very good analysis, which is part of this company's one of their packages that just sort of has these things. Now you can just, if you sort of have your own style that you like, you can remove that and put your own stuff in here, and that way you're not going to be getting those sort of like linting errors and whatnot. That is totally up to you. Okay, so we have this. Now what I need to do is actually create a env file. So we're going to go in here and go .env. And I also want to make sure I've created this. I want to go to my git ignore because I don't want this file to actually be version controlled. So we're just going to go .env in here, and you'll see it will turn, sort of a grayish color in a moment. So we have our .env, and in here we're going to put a few environment variables. We're going to start by putting in our database URL, which we don't really know what it is yet, so I'll just leave it blank. But until my GitHub Copilot's kind of prompting or something, but we'll ignore that suggestion. And a couple other things we're going to probably want is whether the database supports SSL or not, because our local one probably won't, depending on how you set it up, but your remote one may. And I'm also going to paste in something here for a fallback URL, and we can actually type this one in. Basically this would be like, hey, we didn't find a redirect. Where do we want to go? We'll just send people to Google. So we'll come back and actually do these. I'll make this true. We aren't going to be using SSL locally for our database, but we're not sure what this is yet, so we'll come back to that. Okay, so now what I want to do is I like to not access these. I don't ever want to access these strings through my code because it's just open to copy and paste errors. I mean, I have to do it once, but I don't want to be doing it throughout the application. So we're actually going to create some getters here. So for instance, we're going to have these guys right here. So this really just, we'll have something called database URL, which will return something from our environment. And if it doesn't find it, it'll just fall back to an empty string, which naturally will cause issues. But as a developer, we will understand that there's a problem and fix it. We're going to pull that, whether or not the no SSL is enabled. And we're going to pull that fallback URL. Okay. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is get our database connection set up here. So we're going to create another file as a sibling to this called database.dart. And we're essentially going to be creating this wrapper that is kind of agnostic to whether it's Postgres or whatever, meaning we could switch it out with MySQL or something at some point. And this is the interface that we will essentially talk to. We won't be talking directly to Postgres. This will just kind of be that middleman. So we're going to call it database, and we'll just put sort of a constructor here too that isn't going to necessarily do anything. And the first thing we're going to want is let's create a connection function. We'll just call it connect. And right here we're going to want to get our database URL. So let's grab that database URL, and we're going to be getting that from our environment. So we can actually do config, that was the thing we just made, .database URL. So we sort of have that ready. And then with this package, which we'll be importing in a minute, we're going to make something called connection, and it's going to be a PostgreSQL connection. And this is where we have to pass in the host and the port and the database name and all that kind of stuff, which we will get to shortly. I'll just keep it like that. And then the next thing we're going to do is actually take the connection and open it. And we need to remember that this is actually going to be an async function because we're awaiting. And what we will do once it's connected is actually return the connection object. Okay, so what is this actually returning? It's returning a PostgreSQL connection. So let's mark this with returning that. Now, technically, we are actually returning a future that is wrapping this. All right, so now we need to figure out from our database URL. Now we could have, just decided, hey, like let's just have DB host, DB name, password, all that kind of stuff. The reason we're using a database URL is it's a little more friendly with the specific hosting provider we're using, Heroku in this case, but many hosting things use the idea of a database URL. What I want to do is use that because I want this to be able to deploy and just sort of work. So we need to basically parse this database URL. Which we don't know what it is yet. So let's actually get that set up. So what I'm going to do is, this is the way I like to sort of just manage Postgres on a Mac or on Windows or whatever, even Linux, is we're actually going to create a Docker compose YAML file. And this is not meant for the remote. This is really just meant for development. But it's a pretty basic Docker compose file. Basically, we're saying we're just going to create a DB service. We're going to use Postgres 13 to Alpine. This is where we're going to store it, basically in a folder in our project. And then these are the credentials, Postgres, 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 and this is the port mapping. We're just going to use the default Postgres port. So with that file there, what we can now run is we can go Docker compose up, and then we want to do -d just so it actually detaches from the terminal and doesn't keep it running. So that was pretty quick. It's set up, and if I actually load Docker, keep in mind you need Docker installed before this, but I'm not going to do a tutorial on installing Docker. It's very easy. We see we have this URL shortener open now, and it's running Postgres. So if we actually look at sort of the details about this, we can see everything looks good, and we can see, okay, this is the DB, this is the user, this is the password, that kind of stuff. So what we can do now is actually fill in our URL, and actually with GitHub Copilot at least, it's kind of giving me pretty much what I want. So this is the username, this is the password, this is the host, this is the port, and this is the database name. So that's what we kind of want. So now we need to parse that data. So I've put together just a pretty simple parsing function, which I'll walk you through real quick. And we're actually using records here, which I haven't actually used really yet before, but I think it's a perfect thing to do this. So this actually returns a record of a few different parameters. It's actually the first 3 strings, so the username, password, and host, and then an int because the port will be an int, and then the string again for database name. And basically all this is doing is it's splitting everything up and breaking it off and getting it. You can, of course, look through it and make sure everything makes sense, but it's pretty basic. So instead what we can do here for our what we would want to do is actually get those values, and to do that we can basically follow this same sort of convention here. So I can actually just copy this right here and just go, okay, these are going to be the names of the things equal to our thing right there, and we're going to pass in this database URL, which, to just save one line of code, I'm just going to pull this here and put it right there, and we'll get rid of that. And then here you'll see we're passing in host, port, and database name. Now there's a few other options we must pass in here. We want to pass in username, and password. And then the last thing we actually want to pass in is whether to use SSL or not. And if you remember, we have that in our config. We can just go config.use database no SSL, but we actually want to invert that. Because this is actually negative. Now the reason I decided to do the parameter here as database no SSL instead of database use SSL or something like the positive version of this is I kind of want this to be like an optional environment variable, and since my hosting will generally have this by default, will be using an SSL based database, I can just simply omit this environment variable. So basically if this is set, it'll kind of flip it to not using SSL. So you'll see right here, use SSL only if this isn't true, basically. Okay, so we now have a way to connect to our database. That is great. Okay, and the last thing I want to do is just at the bottom of this file is just make essentially a global variable for this. Now there's probably better ways to do this in terms of like different singleton patterns and stuff, but this will work totally fine for our server side application and for learning purposes. So this is how we can just access the database without having to sort of create multiple instances of this. We'll just access it globally from this right here. Okay, so now that we sort of have this, let's actually get a database set up. Now we're going to need a table, at least one to start. And I'm going to put the PSQL code here just to kind of look through it real quick. So the command we're going to be running in our SQL editor is we want to create a table. We're going to call it link, and it's going to have a few different fields. It's going to have an ID that's going to be auto incrementing, and it is going to be our primary key. We're going to be having an original URL, which we're going to allow text. There's going to be a short code with a max length of 10. It needs to be unique and not null. We're going to have a user identifier, and this is just kind of a fancy extra thing we can have so that we can maybe in our whatever's integrating with this, we can actually be tracking like who made this link, as well as a created at, which is going to be a timestamp, and it's going to have a default of now. So anytime it gets inserted, it'll automatically use the server's date time. Okay, so I'm going to take this, and I have a program. It's called pgadmin4. There's plenty of other things you could use. This is just one that I think is quite good and visual, and it's free, which is a huge plus. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new database connection here. Let me just make this a little bigger. I believe it's this button here. Okay, we're going to go register server. And here we'll just call it like linked shortener. And in the connection, we will be putting in localhost here, the default port, this, and we also had our password as Postgres. And we'll just say, yeah, let's save that password. So now we'll see our linked shortener here, and within this we'll have different databases. We have the Postgres database, and within here we'll have schemas, and within here we have public, and within that we have tables. This is really where like we'll be working. Now if we double click on this, we will see nothing is here yet, but we need to sort of run some SQL. So if we actually click this button here, the PSQL tools, we can essentially just paste in what I had there. We will allow it. That seemed to do something kind of funny. Let us cancel that. Okay, a better way to do this because of the multiple lines we have is actually right-clicking here and going Query Tool. And here we can just paste in that code. Like that. And we'll hit this Run button here. Now see, I got this error, and that's because I think when I did try and run it in that other thing, it actually did execute. It just did some weird stuff, but it is here. If you follow that just by doing the query, you should just get that table made. So we can look at this, just to make sure it has the things we want. Yeah, it has an ID, it has an original URL, etc., etc. And everything is good. Okay, so we have our first database table set up, which is great. So now let's get into actually defining our model. So in here, we're going to make just a new file. We're going to call it link.dart. And we're going to make it a link. And the things we're going to allow is an integer, but it's going to be nullable because in theory, there might not be an ID when it's sort of still in memory and not actually saved. We're also going to have a string called original URL, and we're going to have a string for the short code and a date time for the created at. Now we need to obviously create our constructor here. So we just basically, have this.id, which we're not going to require because it is technically nullable, but we are going to require the original URL, the short code, and the created at. All right, and then what I want to do, because eventually we are going to have an API for this, we're going to create a toJSON function. Like so. And this essentially will just convert, we can call on the link to JSON, and it essentially will make it look like this. Okay, so now we need to make some functionality. Now I'm doing this in a really basic way to not over engineering this for purposes. So I've decided to actually just sort of do the CRUD logic within the model so that we can call static methods on the link to insert, to retrieve, that kind of thing. It might be something you'd want to break up into like a service or a repository for sure, but this will work totally fine for what we're trying to do here. So the first thing, let's build a way to create a link. So we're just going to, this will be a static function that returns a link, but if something goes wrong, we want to be able to return null, so we'll allow that. And we'll just call this insert. And we're going to expect that a URL is going to be passed in, as well as a shortcode. And this will be an async function. And here we're going to want to query our database and then basically return the link if it worked, so that we can work with that. So we need to go back to our database class because we don't really have any functionality in here for actually querying. So let's get that sort of set up. So we're going to make a function, and I'm going to just actually put it right at the top here. And we're going to be using, and I'm just going to, for now, kind of do a future dynamic, just so we can kind of figure out what this will actually return. But essentially, we're going to want to pass in a string of the query itself. And in order to do this, we are essentially going to first need to get our database connection. So we're going to make something called connection, and we're just going to go await connect. And again, this needs to be async. So this again returns the PostgreSQL connection right here so that we can do stuff with it. Then we're going to want to do some stuff with it. So we will go await, and we can go connection dot, and this is what I prefer to use. There's a couple different queries you can do, but the mapped results query on this Postgres package will actually return things in a little more readable way instead of the other option is just the query. Now what query returns is basically just a list of it returns a PostgreSQL result, which will just kind of have a list of all the columns in the order they are, but they don't actually have any names associated with it. Whereas when we do a mapped query result, we actually get a map back that will have sort of a relationship of the column name to the value, which to me just is a lot easier to work with than remembering the order of things. Also, if we add new fields to our database, we don't have to worry about switching things. So there we go, we would pass in that query. And after we get that data, we want to close our DB connection. So we'll just do an await on that. And we'll want to return the data ultimately. So what are we actually returning here? Well, according to this, we are going to be returning a list, map strings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You'll see it in a bit. So we'll just put that in there as our return with the future wrapping it. Now, I also want to make sure that we're dealing with database sanitization. If a user puts in a weird, tries to sort of screw up our database, we can kind of protect that. So we're also going to optionally allow a map string dynamic to be passed in here, and we'll call this substitution values. And by default, if it's not passed in, we're just going to do a const of sort of an empty map. Let's just save that. And this luckily takes a parameter called substitution values, so we can actually just kind of forward it through. And that allows us, which you'll see, to actually, anytime we have a dynamic parameter, to have the database automatically deal with escaping and everything and sanitization. Okay, so we now have a way to get this data, which is pretty fun. So let's go back to our link now, and essentially on our insert, we now need a reference to that DB. So we can essentially get that by just going, we have sort of that global aspect of it. So we can grab that. So let's just make something called result. And it's going to be equal to awaiting the DB, which we'll auto import, dot query, which is the function we just made. And we're going to want to put some code in here. So the code, in order to do this in a clean way, what I'm kind of thinking is we actually, as a static method again on the link object, we're going to create something called the insert SQL, just so it's not, you know, messed in here. And we're going to also make a getter called the table name. That way we can, if we ever change our table name, it will always be just in this one spot. So what we want to actually query is that insert SQL. Now you'll see the insert SQL has these placeholders, original URL and shortcode. In Postgres, you can basically pass in variables with an @ in front of it, and then we can substitute it. And that's exactly where that substitution thing came in. So here we want to substitute this right here, original URL. So I'm just passing a map in, and it will be substituted by whatever gets passed in here. And same with shortcode. Now you'll notice anytime you are doing this, even though these are strings, like if I wasn't using substitution and actually just putting in something and it was a string, I would still wrap it in quotes. But anytime you are doing substitutions, you don't wrap them in quotes even if you know it's going to be a string, because the substitution automatically handles that. You'll see a strange error if you try to do it that way. Okay, so we do that. We get our result back, which is going to be this really complicated thing here. And let's actually, before we deal with all of the code here, let's actually see if we can get something inserted. So let's just go like, let's actually print out what the result looks like. And here, just so that we conform to the contract of saying we're going to return something, I'm just going to return null for the time being. So how can we test this? You know, we could create an endpoint, but we haven't really got there yet that we could hit. But my preferred method right now for doing this is we're just going to make a new folder here called tools, and I'm going to make a file called insert link.dart. And in our insert link, this is just going to be like a tool that, you know, really we could delete in a little bit once we know stuff works. But we're essentially going to have a main function, and it's actually going to be a future void of main, meaning we can make it async. And what we're going to do is essentially just go await link. So now this is using the word link is kind of probably wasn't the best decision now that I think about it, because there is something in Dart called link. So we'd have to be careful to import the right one. And we're going to link.insert, which is that function we made. And let's just paste in a fake URL or maybe a real URL. Let's just use https://youtube.com, and we'll make our own shortcode. We just have to make sure it's unique, which right now it will be, and it's less than 11 characters. So now I can just run Dart tools/insert link and see if we get any errors. We don't, and we actually get this data back, which is kind of cool. So let's, first of all, just so we can look at this a little better, I'm just going to paste it in here. And let's go to our PG admin and just kind of refresh this table. And in here, if we go to go here and right click, we can go to view and edit data, and let's just view all rows. And we'll actually see that, okay, cool, something with an ID of 1. This is stored in our database. Awesome. Okay, so let's take a look at kind of how this is. So what this actually returned, and something I didn't point out is we actually in our insert statement go returning star. If all we cared about was getting the ID back, you know, we could just say return ID. But I want to return everything because I want to be able to return, you know, basically all the data that represents that link. So we're doing returning star right there. So this is kind of the response, and what we can do is sort of loop through this. Now, this is returning an array of things. Now, it's a little bit convoluted because it's actually the map, first of all, has the name of the table. Because if you're doing a more complicated query that maybe had a join or is getting, you know, data from different sources, it needs to be able to break those up. So we want to find a good way to essentially turn this back into a link. So to do that, we're going to create a helper function, because this is something I just know we're going to have to do multiple times, whether we're inserting or retrieving or whatever. So we're going to create another static function called, and this will just end up returning a list of links, which is much nicer for us to work with in this case. and we're going to call this map response. I'm doing an underbar because this isn't something we ever want outside of this file to access. It's really just going to be used for internal purposes. And what we're going to be passing into here is basically this object right here. So I can actually just grab this and do here, and we will actually just call this response. And this is where we just need to do a little bit of thinking. So based on that file, we sort of have like an array, and actually let's grab that again. I'm just gonna grab this for reference. Just so we can kind of remember what this looks like while we map this out. So here I'm gonna basically take the response and I'm gonna be returning it, but we're gonna do a transform on it through a map. So we're gonna map through it because we know it's a list already. We'll see it starts with a list. And for each of these items, we'll just call this result. We're gonna wanna return a link. And in here, at the very end, before we forget, we want to convert it back to a list because otherwise it'll just be an iterable and it won't actually be conforming to what we're saying. So how do we get this data now? So in a link, we are required to pass in a few things. The ID, although technically optional, we definitely want it. And what we can do is get something from this result. So you'll see it goes result, and then it goes, okay, the name of the table. So we could just put, link here. But again, we already have a way to do this. We have this thing called table name. So let's make use of that just in case we ever change it. So we can go result, table name, and then the field. So the field in this case is ID. And what we need to do here is actually put either an exclamation mark, or you could be a little more safer and use a question mark and kind of have a fallback to default. But I know this will return. And in fact, if that is not there, something else is more critically wrong, and we probably should, throw some kind of error. So we'll do that. And then what are the other things we need? We need a shortcode. So I'm actually just going to copy and paste all these things in. So we do the same for shortcode. We would do the same for original URL, and we do the same for created at. So we have those. And I think there was, yeah, that's all of our parameters that at least we have in the model. So this now is returning these things, and we should be good. Now, it probably is a good idea to wrap this in a try catch because maybe something went wrong. And in this case, maybe we return null and we print out the error. So that means if we are doing that, we want to, of course, go like this. Now, just for simplicity and not worrying about all this null safety stuff and for learning purposes, I'm not going to worry about that. I am just going to assume it works, and otherwise it will crash completely ungracefully. But if something really went wrong with this, other than a developer making a typo on what this is spelt, something else went wrong with it, so it's fine in my opinion. So now over here, what we can actually do is we can just return that map response result. And what we want to do is, because we're just creating one, we actually only want to return whatever the first one is. It should only ever be one passed in. That is what we should expect. And we're just going to return the first of it. So now if we go back to our lovely testing thing, let's actually capture this now. Final link equals this. Now, what could this be? This is technically a nullable link, and the reason it's nullable is something could go wrong here. So let's, in this case, in the insert, we will actually wrap this in a try so that we can be a little bit more graceful and return null, and we'll print out that error for our own logging purposes. And then back over in our insert link, we can do something like, if link does not equal null, print link. And then, we could go else. This is just our own tool, so it doesn't really matter what we do here. We can say print error. So let's try that out again. I will make this say youtube.com/Tyler. And we're going to make this a different thing because we will actually get an error. And let's just insert this. And we should see now instance of link. Cool, okay, it seems like it worked, but this isn't very helpful, right? Like, oh great, an instance of link. I want to know more about it. So in Dart, we can of course, and I'll just do this at the bottom as it's pretty common, we can do an override on the toString method and actually return what we want. And in this case, maybe we want to return the short code and like this and the original URL. It might also be helpful for database purposes to get the ID. So maybe at the very start, we also get the ID. So now if we run that same thing again, and we will just change this to foobar2 and maybe Tyler2, we actually see a more readable thing. So that's nice. Okay, now I don't really want to have my, say I had logic in my API to actually generate these sorts of things. I kind of want to have one centralized place that deals with generating the random code and also ensuring that it's unique and all that stuff in one centralized spot. So what we're actually going to do is change insert to an underscore insert. Let's never allow the outside world to call this. And instead, we're going to have a static function that is essentially going to still return the same thing here. And we're going to call it create. And here we're going to allow passing in the original URL. And for the purposes of now, that's really all we care about, because we actually want to be auto-generating this thing here. So the first thing we want to do is I'm just going to do a little helper thing where we take the original URL and actually trim it. Just, we don't really want like empty spaces at the start or empty space at the end. That might cause issues. So we'll do that. And then we need a way to generate a random string. And if you've seen some of my videos before, you've probably seen this exact same snippet. So I'm actually going to make a new file just called utils.dart. Keeping this very basic, the organization, if this was a bigger project, could benefit from, breaking it up into different things and modules, but we're not going to worry about it. So this is just a generate random string function where we can pass in a length, and then from a subset of characters. This is the default. It's basically all of our alpha characters, both uppercase and lowercase. No numbers, no symbols. You can do whatever you want. And this will essentially, based on the length, just return a random string. So therefore in here, if we wanted, we could basically create the shortcode by going shortcode equals, it is called generate random string, and our length in our database I think was 10, so we'll just use that. And then what we can do is essentially call our insert function, right? Then we can go return insert, and we still pass in that original URL, but then we pass in the shortcode we make. And this is good, and this will usually work. However, we're not doing anything to check if this is actually unique or not. We need a way to essentially call the database first and make sure that it doesn't already exist. But let's test this out before we jump to any conclusions. And we're just going to change this now to create. And now we're not passing in the shortcode. We are just going like this. And let's go and run this. And unless like stuff really was random and worked, this should just work. And we'll see if we run the same one again, we'll get a different shortcode back. There's a small chance, not a zero chance, that there could be a conflict and we'd have a database error and everything can go bad. So let's deal with that. But in order to even deal with that, we need a way to look these things up. Right now we only have code for inserting, so we definitely need a way to retrieve our data back. Okay, so I'm going to make a function, and we'll do it, I think after the create makes sense. So it's going to be another static function, and it's going to be, it's going to return a link, but technically it might not find one, so we'll make it nullable, and we'll just call it retrieve. And it's going to be async. And we want to pass in, for our case right now, just because this is the one we deal with, let's pass in a string called the shortcode. So we can basically retrieve one with that shortcode. Now here, we're going to want to do another DB query. So in this case, it's going to be select star from table name where ID is equal to ID. Now I made a mistake because this should actually be where short code is equal to at short code. And the things we want to pass in is this replacement for shortcode to shortcode. And now what we want to do is just check if the response dot is empty, meaning nothing came back. We're just going to return null. Otherwise, we will return that map response again of our response, but we want again the first one. This is a retrieve. We should only get one back. If for some reason something weird happens, which because of our uniqueness won't, we just will return the first. And again, we can wrap this whole thing in a try catch. just to see if anything went wrong. And if something did go wrong, we'll print our error and we'll return null. Okay, so that's our retrieve. And let's just try and work with that now. So we could just basically just write some code here, generate the short code, then run the retrieve function, make sure it doesn't exist, and then if all is good, continue on. If not, throw an error. But the nicer thing to do would actually be, okay, if there was a conflict, let's generate another one. And the best way to do that, other than duplicating your code and kind of hoping like you've copied and pasted enough time, is making a recursive function. So we are going to create a recursive function for this. So what we're going to call it is, and this is going to return a string, again wrapped in a future because we're going to be dealing with some I/O, and we'll just call it unique. We'll just call it like unique short code. And here it's going to be async, and we're going to take that code that we put here and actually move it up here. And so we get our short code back, and then we want to check if it exists. So we're going to go final exists equals await, and we're going to use our retrieve function, passing in the short code, and we want to just make sure it isn't null. Technically we want to check to make sure it is null, but we're going to check if it's not null, meaning this is now a Boolean. Then what do we do? So we want to say if it does exist, which is a rare occurrence, but if you had a lot of people using this, it could potentially happen. We want to actually run this function again. So we're going to actually return the output of this function. And at the very bottom, so if it doesn't exist, we'll just actually return this shortcode. So 99.999% of the time, this is going to just go here, generate a code, be like, yeah, it doesn't exist, cool, return. But there might be those cases where it actually comes up with the same code that already exists. And if your shortcode URL length was maybe only 1, 2, or 3, that would happen more often. So this should work fine. And basically here now, we actually make something called shortcode. And we just need to await that function that we just made. So it will get one, and this will always be unique. Now the one caveat here is we have 10 places of in our shortcode, and there's 26 times 2 because of uppercase and lowercase. If we multiply those numbers together, it's an astronomically large number. In theory, if this thing became the most popular link shortener in the world, this could essentially run forever. If we've used every single thing. So, but that would be a great problem to have. And the way to solve it, just add one more number to this, make it 12. And now you have millions more of options. So we're not going to worry about handling that edge case because that is not going to happen for this small tutorial project. Okay, one thing I want to do before I get too ahead is we have this retrieve function, but it is kind of specific to retrieving by a shortcode. So I'm actually going to rename this retrieve by shortcode, and we're actually going to make this a private function, and we'll just use this here. And the reason I want to do that is we're actually going to, I'm going to duplicate this, and we're going to have another one where we retrieve by ID, because that might be something we want to do. And let's just go int ID. And the only difference here is we would be using where ID is equal to ID, limit 1, and then ID. So that will allow us to retrieve by ID. And we can do the same thing for instance, maybe we have a reason in the future to look it up by the actual URL. So we can do retrieve by original URL, and in this case, string original URL. And here we would just change ID to basically be original URL. And I just need to make sure we make, I did that wrong. This is the only thing that should be underscore. That's how we have it in our database, but we're going to use Dart-based notation for everything else. So we have these three things now, which is handy. And what we can actually do is make a function called static future link, and we'll just call this retrieve. And here we're actually going to allow some optional things to be passed in. For instance, an int ID, a string called, it's going to be nullable, shortcode, And then what's the other one? Original URL. And what we can basically do is allow, people using our API, other developers using this, talking to our link model to kind of get it in a few different ways. And we just want to check, we'll start with ID. If ID does not equal null, we essentially want to return the result of our retrieve by ID, right? Passing in that ID. And we can basically do the same thing. If shortcode doesn't equal null, we would do retrieve by shortcode. And we can do if original URL doesn't equal null, retrieve by original URL. And if for some reason they decided not to include any of those, we will just return null. So that's just a handy way that in our code, like in our testing code or in our actual implementation, we can use this one function and kind of optionally pass in either of these three parameters. Okay, great. Okay, so aside from some advanced sort of stuff we're going to add maybe in a little bit, this has everything we really need to create and retrieve our URLs, our links. So let's get into actually creating our API. So I'm going to go into the routes directory. We can delete this test one that we had, and let's make a new folder, and we're going to call it API. Now inside API, we are going to, first of all, let's just make an index.dart, and we'll actually copy the code that we had here. And on request, what we're actually going to do is we can do response.json to send JSON back. And in this case, we can just do something like, online true. And if we go back to our thing now and actually hit the /API endpoint, we actually get online true. This just might be a handy thing, check someone integrating with this service can first check, hey, is it online? And it appears to be because it's served back. So we're good there. Now also inside API, let's make something called link.dart. And this is where we're going to have all of our actual API operations for the link. And you'll see I'm getting some errors here, and that's because there's stuff that's kind of still in memory. It's looking for these files. So sometimes when you delete stuff, especially in the routing folder, you might just want to stop and restart so you don't see these error messages. Okay, so in our link, we are going to essentially have another onRequest method. Let's actually, just because we love to copy and paste, we're going to paste this in here, and we need to sort of import in those sorts of things. And so we haven't really talked about this context. We haven't had use for it yet, but it essentially gives us stuff about the request, maybe like post data that was sent up or the method and that kind of thing. And in this case, we do care about the method. We're essentially going to be building sort of these endpoints that allow us to list all the links, retrieve the links, and create. So it'll be something like, our base URL /API/link when we're doing just a get. Maybe we'll list all the links back to us, or we'll be able to retrieve one by passing in a parameter, or we'll be able to create one by posting to that same endpoint. So we do really care about the method, first of all. So let's start with that. And what we're going to do is a switch on the context.request.method. And here what we can do is check the different HTTP methods. So we can import in that and go HTTP method.get. If there's get, we're going to do something, right? And we'll just do that for now. I'll just return nothing for a minute. Oops. And if we had a post request, we might do something differently. Okay. So and then there might be some other requests that we don't want to support. Like we don't really care about if someone tries to hit this with a delete endpoint, we don't want to do anything or any of this other stuff. And if they are doing this, we're just going to send back a method not allowed request response. And I can just import this from Dart.io and everything's good. These are the ones we care about. So let's, first of all, we now need to find a way. Now we could just write our code in here to say like, okay, go get all my guys and return it back. But I like the idea of just kind of having a separate function for this. So we're just going to do a response here, and we are essentially going to do one for, we'll start with our list method. So we'll call it list, and it is also going to take a request context. And now it's going to be async because we're going to want to actually do some database queries. So we actually want to wrap this in a future. And because we're ultimately going to be returning this when we call a get, we also need to essentially wrap this in a future and make it async. And we're good there. Now I'll do the same thing here for, and this one will be called create. And here we will return create. Now we do have to pass in something to these. You're seeing this error here. We want to just pass that context through so that these have access to it, which they're already set up to do. Okay, so in our list endpoint, let's start with that. So really what we can do in list is we want to get all of our links. So we want to do something like final links equals await link dot list, for instance. And then we want to essentially return that. Now we don't have this yet, so let's make that really quick. This one will be pretty simple. I also realized because we're using link and Dart.io has link, we have a conflict. So I can, we could use a different model name, but I'm just going to hide from Dart.io the link. And then you'll see this has an error, and we can go like this and actually import it from our version. So now if we go here, and actually we want to make our link function, our list function, let's do it just under, yeah, I feel like list makes sense to do right here. So static, this will return a future list of link, and we'll call it list. And this is an endpoint for, you know, URL shortener. You don't necessarily need, maybe it'd be helpful for like analytics and stuff, but just to kind of show like our API, I think it's definitely, you know, worth doing here. Okay, so let's make that list function. So this one's really simple. We're just gonna go final response equals await db.query. And this would just really be like select star from table name. Now be careful, you know, when you are putting your SQL in here, you need a semicolon here for the SQL statement, and then obviously you need your Dart one there. We forgot to make this async. And what we want to return here is basically just that map response function that we've already made. See, it's good that we made that function. Imagine having to duplicate, you know, this code wherever it is like multiple times. That would be really annoying. Okay, so now we have this, and we can actually get our links back. And in here, we don't want to just return the links as they are. We need to wrap them in a response. So we're going to make a response, and it's going to be another response.json like we kind of did in that online, offline thing. And the body is going to be the links. And I think actually that works as we have the two JSON on it. We'll find out if it works or not. And then for our create, we need to sort of set that up for this file not to throw an error. So let us do that right now. What can I return? I'm just going to sort of return, let's just grab this. I'm just going to return kind of like nothing, just so it doesn't have an error. Okay, so let's try this out. Let's restart our server. And see, so far so good. Let's hit /API again to make sure that's online. We're online. And now we can go /link. And we get back all of our links. So this was basically, yeah, this just worked fine. Now if you didn't create that toJSON method, because you're like, I don't have a need for that. Like, let's just show you what it looks like if we don't do that. So we'll turn off our toJSON. And if we refresh here, we're actually going to get an internal server error, and it's saying failed to do this instance, and that's because we need a toJSON method for the response to come back as JSON. And there we have it. So here's all of our lovely links. We have that working. So let's also do one for retrieve, or let's do the create one now. This is the more exciting one, right? So here we go. So for this, we need access to our post data. So we can get that, and that's going to be a map string dynamic of our JSON data. And we get that by awaiting context.request.json. So we have this data, and that's basically just to kind of show in perspective. On our create link, we're going to allow passing in, the URL that you're going to want to generate. So we need access to that. It's not part of the URL, it's part of the post data. And what we also want to do is make sure that the users has that included. So we can just say, if we're not including that key, we want to return an error, essentially saying param URL is required, and send back a 400 status code, which is a fancy way of saying, you gave me a bad request. Then all we need to do, if we had that, we'll go final, and we're going to make a link, and we're going to essentially call our link.create function that we've already kind of tested. And here is where we would pass in that URL, which we can get. We already know it's there. Everything's good. Now we might want to sanitize this. We might want to trim it. But I think our create is already trimming it. It is, look. So we can just pass it in like that. And if there's an extra space, it'll be gone. You could definitely do some validation here. Make sure, it's has HTTP in the URL, et cetera, et cetera. But this is fine for now. Then we get the link back. And we want to check, because this could be null, right? Something could have gone wrong. So we can go, if link equals null, maybe we want to return a response that has, I'll call it detail, and I'll say something went wrong. And in this case, the status code would be like a 500 error because, the user didn't screw up, just something went wrong in our process and we want to tell them about it. So we'll make it 500. Otherwise, we're just going to return the link back. So let's test that out. So I'm using Postman. You could do this with curl. You could do this by building, a website that talks to this thing. But Postman is a really easy way to set these things up. And just to kind of show you real quickly, because I set this up prior to this, we basically created an API collection just in case we have other things we want to have within here, and then a folder for link. And basically in here we have this thing base URL, and the way that works, you can create environments in Postman and actually set up variables. That way you can reuse them and change them. And I could set up also a production environment so that I can switch between them and test. So all I'm doing here is just hit this base URL with API/link. We already saw this working. We see all of our links coming back. We haven't done retrieve yet, so we'll skip that one. But we'll have create, and I'm going to test this out. And fingers crossed, here we go. We have a new ID 6. Now watch, if I hit this again, we actually go up ID 7 because it's creating a new one. It's a new shortcode. We have a different created at date. That is working. We're going to make that a little bit better in a bit where we can reuse URLs, but our post is working. So let's also do one for retrieving. Now, this was one thing that bothered me, and maybe it doesn't bother anyone else, but something that although we have the support for those sort of like dynamic routes, in my ideal world, I would love link to be in a separate folder, which we can still do. We can move link to a different folder just to sort of clean this up and rename this index. And that should still behave the exact same way. And we'll just save that file. Let's just make sure we can still list links. Everything's good. And in my ideal world, there would kind of be, we would make a file here called, .id.dart, so that we could essentially have an endpoint that would be like, API/link/1 to actually get URL. But one downside right now about Dart Frog is you can't use these sort of like dynamic URLs if there's another file in the same folder. So the way I got it, because the way I got around it is we're just going to essentially for retrieve link pass in this sort of parameter here of the short code. It's not as restful, it's not as nice, but it allows us to do this. So let's make our retrieve function now, and I'll just paste it in because it's very simple, and we'll just walk through it. So retrieve, we're going to essentially pass in a short code, and then we are going to try and retrieve it. If it's not null, we're going to return that link. and I realized we don't actually need to run the to.json because it automatically will. That's just something that Shelf and Frog are doing automatically. But if it is null, we want to return a 404 error code. So the way I managed to do this, and it works fine, is we can, in our get endpoint, actually check if there's a query parameter. So we can get our query params by going context.request.uri.query_parameters. And this will return a map for us. And we can essentially check if query parameters.contains key, short code. Then, instead of returning list, we'll actually return that retrieve function we made while passing in the short code. And to get that, we can just go query parameters, short code. And because this is technically null, we could, we could go like this. We already kind of know what's in there, so that's safe enough to do. We're gonna pass that in because we've already checked it contains the key. Technically, the key could be null, but in a query parameter, at the very least, it's going to be an empty string, which is not null. So that's good enough. And basically now it will, if the short code's in it, it'll try and retrieve it. So let's try and hit this ABC123. Something. If it contains key short code, yeah. Oh, I didn't save. That would do it. So we got detail not found, and that makes sense because we don't have ABC123. But let's grab foobar, for instance, and replace it here. Now, something else you can do in Postman, instead of like doing it right in the URL, you can actually do it in this nice table here, and you can have different parameters, and it all handles it. Postman's awesome. And if we do this, we now just get the single result back. Okay, it's time to figure out the redirecting, which is in some ways the most important part of this project. It's really the purpose, having someone be able to come to a URL and redirect. So to do that, we're going to go right in the route, right in our routes folder, and we have this index.dart. We're going to rename this. So we're actually going to rename this opening square bracket dot dot dot, and I'm going to call it short code. It can really be called whatever you want. And right in here, we now want to actually get access to that short code. And let's just, put in the short code here, just to make sure it works. We've already kind of seen this at the start of the video, but let's just take a look. So now if I go, slash blah, 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 it goes, welcome to Dart Frog, do-do-do-do-do. If I do foobar, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so what we actually want to do here is, this will need to be asynchronous now because we are going to be talking to our database. And what we want to do is actually get access to it. So let's try and find a link. So final link equals await link dot retrieve. Now this is, we need to import link from here, retrieve. And we want to retrieve, this is why we made this retrieve function. Look, we can pass in a few different options, but in this case, we want to pass in short code and do short code. And we want to check if link does not equal null. We're going to just, for now, just going to return like response dot JSON body link. Otherwise, if for some reason something went wrong, we'll return response.json detail not found, and we'll give it a status of 404. And we just remember to pass in body. Oh yeah, these are both named parameters, of course. Wait, what is wrong here? Oh yeah, it's status code. That's why. Okay, so let's just test this out. We'll go here and we will hit our foobar, which we get back the link. Cool. But if we do something that's like unheard of, we'll get the not found. But really what we want to do here is actually redirect someone somewhere. So in order to do this, we actually aren't going to be returning JSON anymore. We're returning a very special kind of response where we're actually just going to pass in the headers, and we're going to go location, and we're going to take that link dot original URL. And we're going to do a status code of 302 in this case, which is kind of like a redirect status code, so that it just gets followed properly, and we can get rid of this. Now here, let's say it didn't find something. We're going to do something very similar. We're actually going to return them though to sort of that default URL that we created. So we can just go config dot, and we can do fallback URL. So that was just that thing we set in our environment, which falls back to Google ultimately, so that if something's not found, we actually redirect back there. And if you were building this for, a specific product or something, you'd probably want this to go to the marketing page of your, product's website, so that if wrong URLs come through, at least they still go somewhere that's helpful to you. So let's test this out. We're going to try foobar, and I think this one should go to YouTube. So we go, it redirects us to YouTube, very good. Then if we do something not found, we should go to Google. So our redirecting is working, yay. All right. Helpful feature of a URL redirector is actually tracking clicks. So let's set up a way to do that. We're not going to go into all the CRUD for it or the API because we've kind of already done that, but I want to show how we could track this stuff. So what I want to do is run create another table. So I'll show you the SQL for this one. It's essentially going to have an ID, just the primary key essentially. It's going to have a reference to that link using the ID. It's going to have a created at, and we're going to also track the user's IP address. That way, if we wanted to run those through MaxMind or something, we could kind of have a chart, a map of where people are actually clicking through on these links. So we're going to grab this and go to our lovely admin, PHP or PG admin, and we're going to go back to query tool, and I'm going to paste this in, and we're going to click play to run it. And if we right click and refresh here, we should see the click table, which has those columns that we set up. And of course we could follow the same pattern, and we could create a model that represents this, a click and all that kind of stuff. But I want to keep this really simple. Feel free to obviously do that on your own. So essentially what we're going to do before we actually do the redirect is we're going to run sort of this function here that is just going to do just a raw query where we're going to pass in, we're going to insert into click the link ID and the user IP with these values here, link ID and user IP, which I know we don't have yet. And we're just going to, insert that into the database. So for user IP, we'll get to that in a minute, but let's just make sure this works. So I'm just going to make something called user IP equals localhost or something. Let's do 127.0.0.1. And let's test that out. So I'm going to go back to our testing thing and do foobar. And nothing's different from the user's point of view, but I would think if I come back here and actually go and view all rows, we'll see a record here referencing to that link, the timestamp, and my pretend user IP here. Now, how do we get the user IP? So it's a little bit of a complicated thing, especially if you're hosting this on a different kind of server. If this was a very basic setup, you can actually just get it from the request, and in order to get that, we can actually just make something. I'll just make it temp because we will be doing this a little bit better. Temp equals this. So we can get context.request.connectioninfo.remoteaddress.address, and that would return us, the IP address of the person. However, if you're hosting this on, something like Unicorn, or some more complex, production-ready server, you may actually find by doing this, you're actually getting the IP address of your web server, which is not helpful at all. It'll always be the same unless the IP changes, but either way, it's useless. So what we actually want to do is get it this way. This just took a bit of trial and error for me to get to. But we can look in the headers for something called x forwarded for, which a lot of web servers will send through. And we'll use that. But if it's null, then we'll try x real IP, which is another thing that some servers send through. Otherwise, we'll fall back to that remote address. So that's good. Now, sometimes though, when you get this back, you'll actually get sort of like a an address with some sort of jargon in front of it. And we can actually, let's just do some testing where we print out the user IP, and I'm just going to then return a response. It's just basically empty so that we don't keep getting redirected. But let's just see what that actually conforms to in this case. So I'll just go foobar, so it's one that actually works. And you'll see we got, this weird looking thing, right? It has, these symbols and FFF. So what I chose to do is we just want to kind of wrap this in something. So if user IP contains a colon, we're going to split on it and just get the last part of it. There we go. So that would get us that. Also, you might find that sometimes you'll get back actually two addresses, like kind of like an IPv4 and an IPv6. So we also want to check after that, we want to check if there's a comma. And if there's a comma, we want to just split on it and get the first one. And we also want to just make sure, in case like some really weird IP address comes in, we want to make sure if the length is greater than 15, because that's what we sort of have in our database as an IP address max length. Let's just set it back to an empty string, because it's not really a proper IP address, and we don't want to ruin the user experience by having the database make complain. So we'll just set it back to there, and that's how we can kind of get our user IP. So now if I grab this and put everything back as it was, and we refresh here, and if we go back to our PG admin, and there should be a way to refresh this. I guess I can just click play again. We'll actually see this. Now, it happened to be the same, and that's because I'm running this on localhost. But when we actually get to deploying this to a server, we'll kind of see some real data here. So cool, we're tracking IP addresses now. The other tiny little thing I wanted to deal with is, well, first of all, I'm going to, I'm allowed to delete the test folder. Okay, I'm allowed. This is educational. We don't care about it right now. I want to deal with two other little things. One, reusing URLs so that it's not generating a new database record if someone's used the same URL, and allowing people to have custom URLs. So let us figure out that right now. So we're just going to close up everything because I got a lot of files, and we're going to go back to our link.dart. And what we're going to do is in our create function is allow a Boolean to be passed in. We'll call it reuse URL. And we'll make it true by default, but there might be reasons that we want it to be unique. And then we'll also optionally allow a string to be passed in called custom shortcode. And right after we get this original URL, let's check if reuse URL is true. Then we're going to check if it already exists. So we can go if existing, or final existing equals await, and we can use that retrieve by original URL function we made and pass in the original URL. And assuming existing does not equal null, then we will just return the existing one, and it won't even go and try and make a new one. So let's just test that out. So I'll go back to Postman, to our create, and we have one for tallysavery.com, which returns this. And in theory, if I hit this again, there we go. It's giving us back the same one. So that's cool. We'll always get that. Now, if I was to change this to, /test, and hit send, I would get a new one back, a new code. But again, if I keep hitting this and spamming this, I'm going to just keep getting that same one. So we're not going to clutter our database with certain things. Now, what about a custom code? So if we wanted someone to have a custom shortcode, how could we, deal with that? So in our unique, what I'm going to do is allow our unique shortcode function to allow the ability to paste in, or to pass in rather, a string. So it'll be optional, and custom shortcode. And right here, what we'll do is we'll say, okay, the shortcode is going to be equal to the custom shortcode. But if that's null, we'll fall back to our generate random string. And here we want to still check, does it exist? Cool. And then in this case, if it exists, we would then just call this function again without passing it in, because in theory, if someone's using a custom shortcode, but that custom shortcode is already used, we don't want to just like allow them to take it over. So the first try it will use, this if it's not null, and then if it does exist, we're just going to, essentially run it again. So let's just try that out. Now, in order to do that, we have to kind of make an update to our API. So we're going to go back to our API link index. And in our create function, so we already have the thing for the data there. But what we can also do is let's make a variable. We'll make it a nullable string called custom short code. And we can check if data.contains key, and we'll call it custom short code. Then we will get that value. So we'll say final, and I'll just call this just temporarily CSC equals data this. And the reason I'm doing that is because we want to do a little bit of validation here. We want to make sure someone's not passing in, an inappropriate thing that would ruin things. So then I'll just do a to-do here. We want to validate that. But basically, if it's there and it's valid, we will then set this to the CSC custom shortcode. Then over here in our link.create, we will pass through custom shortcode, which we're always going to pass it through, but a lot of the time, if this isn't passed, it'll just be null and everything will just work as it used to do. So let's just test that out without worrying about the validation, and we'll validate it. But so I can just do, custom shortcode Tyler, and let's just do a completely new one. So there we go. We have this lovely thing, but the shortcode did not actually go through. That's interesting. And the reason is, although we allow this, we're not actually passing it into our unique shortcode function, which unique shortcode allows us to pass in a custom shortcode. So we just want to pass that through. So let's try that again. Go back to Postman. I'll just make this Tyler123 and custom shortcode Tyler. So there we got back our custom shortcode. So that's pretty cool. But there's some validation we want to do because, for instance, we don't want anyone to have something that's too short or too long. So let's create a little validation function that we can reuse in potentially different places. So I'm going to put that in right at the bottom of this file, right above the, where are we in? Oh, not this file. I want to do it right in the link file, and we'll just do it right near the bottom. And this is just going to be a static function we can call shortcode is valid, where we pass in a shortcode. And here's the things I want to check. Make sure the length is greater than or less than 3, greater than 3, but less than or equal to 10, because that's where our database says, no, we can't have it bigger. And we also want to make sure that they don't make the shortcode API or they don't make the shortcode link. Although we do have the link would technically allow, be allowed. So, but this is where you kind of white or blacklist the things you wouldn't want for shortcodes. And if you had a lot, maybe you wanted some swear words that you didn't want to let people use, et cetera, you could put this in a separate file. But basically, I just want to check a few of those things. So then what we can do is when we actually create these things, we have this to do to validate. So we can go if link dot shortcode is valid, CSC, then we would set it. So in that case, if I typed in, and we'll just try it out real quick. Let's go back to Postman and let's make the shortcode I want to use API. And I will have to change this, or it will just get the one that exists. You'll see I still got back this sort of thing. But if I made it like, API 2, for instance, although this link already exists, so let's make a new one, we'll actually allow that to use. Also, if I made this really long, it'll just generate me a unique one. So rather than setting an error back, we'll just generate it for someone because it's just an easier integration with our API to work with, to always get something back that you can expect. And this little bit of validation logic that we did, it might make sense to actually happen in a different place, just in case we reuse this functionality somewhere. So what we can actually do in here is, if it exists, and we can use our validate function. What was that called again? Shortcode is valid. So we want to say if it exists or the shortcode is not valid, we don't want to return that, right? So we'll just kind of have that extra thing in here to go and generate it again. All right, so that's basically this MVP in a nutshell. What I want to kind of show now, because a URL shortener running on localhost is kind of useless, is how can we get this on the cloud, right? So we're going to be using Heroku for this, but it will be done with a Docker file, so it is pretty portable. Essentially, all I need to do is right in the root of my project, I'm going to make a new file called Docker file. And there are various ways to do this, and in fact, there's instructions specifically for Dart Frog to put this on AWS and various other places, which is partly why I'm choosing Heroku, just because it is a popular place where people host things, and there isn't any tutorial for it. So I'm just making a simple Docker file that is using Dart, and we're making our working directory app. And basically, when this thing runs, we want to activate the Dart Frog CLI like we did. We want to copy our files. We want to do a pub get, and then we want to run Dart Frog build, and that will actually run the build function, which we haven't actually even done before. Why don't we do that just so you can kind of see what it actually does when you run this. So we can run Dart Frog build, and you'll see it makes a build folder with all these things in it. Now, another approach you could do, which actually in some ways would be simpler, because when you do the build, it actually generates a Docker file for this thing to run. The problem is I don't want to version control my build folder and have to deploy this in a complicated way where I'm really only pushing this up. So that's why I like it this way. We're actually doing the build in Docker. So we run the build, and then we actually compile the exe. And then if you are just using like a standard Docker thing, you also want this command to actually run app bin server. So the app is the working directory, and then this gets moved to build. Sorry, this would actually be app build bin server. So that's app build bin server. That's what we actually want to run and compile. But in the case of Heroku, it works a little bit differently. We don't actually want to put our run command here. We actually make a new file, and we're just going to call it heroku.yml. So this is different than a proc file, because we are using a container instead of using like a normal build pack like usually you do on Heroku. But we want to say build docker web and then use that Docker file. Cool. And then we want to supply the command here. So when we actually run, we want to run app build bin server. Now, there's a little bit of setting up now we just have to do with getting this as a Git repository, as well as setting up the Heroku app. So let's do the Git repository really quick. And in fact, I realized we don't actually need I mean, you would want one for sure, like you're going to want to version control this, but for what I'm showing you now, I don't actually need a remote Git, I just need a local Git. So I can actually just go git init, right? And now it's actually, a Git file. And I want to make sure now that I've Git initialized it, that there's not something that I'm tracking that I shouldn't be, but I think it mostly looks good. Oh, there is one more thing. Because we're using Docker, Docker Compose, we have this data folder. We definitely don't want to version control this, so let's just go data, and we'll see it's gone. So build isn't there, data isn't gone, our env file's not being tracked, and our pubspec.lock isn't being tracked. All these other files, other than we put these ones in, this came with Dart Frog just kind of as a default, and it's all good. Okay, so I'm going to move over to Heroku now, and I'm just going to create a new app, and we're just going to call it URL Shortener, and this already probably exists. It's not available, so let's just call it. I'm going to call it Tyler's Tyler's shortener. Sure. And all this is good, and I'm just going to create the app. Now, the next thing we want to do is actually just set up a couple of resources here, and actually just one. We need Postgres. So I'm just going to use Postgres, and I'm just going to use the mini one for teaching purposes. And we have that. And you'll actually see and this is the reason we're using database URL. If we go to environment variables now, we'll actually see it automatically put this in for us. And if for some reason there's some maintenance needs to be done and they need to switch it, this environment variable will automatically get changed. So our code is going to be looking for this, as we sort of did at the start of this tutorial. Okay, so we have that set up. The next thing we want to do is actually set up this app as a container type deployment, and we can do that through the CLI. So the command is pretty simple. We just do, it's Heroku stack set container, like that, and we need to just pass in the app name, --app, and I forget what we called it, Tyler's shortener, something like that. So I'll set it up as a container base instead of trying to look and examine your code to be like, oh, it's a Python project or it's a JavaScript project. And now we just want to commit our code. I'm not going to push this to a remote GitHub or anything yet. I'll do that in the video. There'll be a link to it, but I just want to get through all the good stuff. And we'll just call this initial commit. And here I'm just going to git push Heroku main. Now oh, we also, sorry, there's one thing we forgot. We have to actually add the remote. So git Heroku git remote a, the name of the app. And before we do this, let's just make sure our environment has everything it needs. So we do already have the database URL. We don't need this one because Heroku will be using SSL, so that's why we can keep it omitted. And fallback URL, we might want to put and I'm going to do that. So I can just go to my environment settings, and maybe I want, this to go to my little website. Okay, so let's try this. Now, disclaimer, DevOps stuff, complicated. I probably missed a step, but we're going to learn together. So git push Heroku main. So it seems to recognize it as a Docker-based thing based on the command we ran a minute ago. And it's doing all of its Dockery goodness. And it seems to be running this command. Let's open the Docker file and kind of follow along with it. So it's setting the working directory. Right now it appears to be activating Dart+Frog, which it did. And you can see these are similar things that you see locally when you're doing a pub install. Now it is doing the build. Or no, that was still the activate. Now it is doing the Dart pub get right here. And now it's doing the Dart+Frog build, which we ran locally very recently, and it worked. So hopefully it works here. And now we're running the compile. Okay, so now it's built and it's actually pushing it over to the registry. Okay, then the deploy is finished. So there's still one more thing we have to do because we have a new database, but we didn't actually run those commands yet. But first, let's just make sure it's working. So in Heroku, I can go open app, and this does that redirect as we thought. Now, what I can do is find the URL for this. Oops, can I just copy link? And I can paste in, /API, and we should just get that online true. But if I actually try and go to, some random URL, I guess it just, falls back because something went wrong. Cool. But we need our database there, because if I actually go now to Postman, let's just try it in Postman, and I'm going to edit my environment variables here for the production one to use that same URL, which I might already have on my clipboard, but let's just get it again. So let's go here and edit this to use a different one. There shouldn't be a trailing slash. Let's make sure we don't have that. And I think I just have to go like that. So let's try creating a link, for instance. And we won't even worry about the short code part. So we get something went wrong. We don't know exactly what it is. We could look at our Heroku logs, figure it out. But I'll tell you, the reason is our database doesn't have any tables yet. So pretty simply, we really just need to set up another database connection here. So I would go, create a new, register a new server, and we would call this like URL or link shortener prod or something. And we would go in here and actually paste in the stuff, which I'm going to do really quickly by just grabbing it from here. And even though this is something I wouldn't really want to put on a live stream, I will be deleting this project very soon, so I don't care if you can see the password. So this is the username, so we can just start with that. Where's username? Username is this. It's not letting me paste in. Oh, I think I copied instead of pasted. God damn. Okay, username. This is the very long password that you can try, but this database will be gone by the time you see it. This is the host, this whole long thing here. This is the port, which is default, so it should already be set 5432. And then what's the last thing? The database name. That's the maintenance database. I'll try that. So link shortener prod. Now go to databases. And I believe it's probably because SSL is not set. Connection. Whoa, what are all these? Parameters. SSL mode. Prefer. So that seems like it should work. It could just be the database name that's wrong. Okay, so it did work the way we did it. However, what I recommend doing if you are using this tool is, so you have all the things that I showed before, but go to the advanced tab and just put in a DB restriction, because the way Heroku databases work, it's a whole bunch on one big RDS. It was essentially like listing me 13,000 databases that I didn't have access to, whereas if you put this restriction, it will only show that one. And that's the one we care about. So now if we actually connect to it and go here, we'll see our schemas, public, and tables, and these should be empty now. So let's run that query tool. And I'm just going to grab those queries that I have. So we have our create for the links, and we need our one for our click. And just so this looks a little nicer, I'll de-indent it. So now I can click run, and the queries ran, and everything's good. So if we go back to Postman now and actually run this here, and I am going to do a short code so I can get this really sweet one here. Hit this, we actually get it back. So that's all good. And now if we actually opened up this URL, open app, I'm just going to copy this link, go here, /Tyler. This should redirect me to this website. All right, so we're all up and running. Now, with URL Shortener, naturally, probably the next thing you'd want to do is go into your settings and actually add a custom domain, preferably a short domain. Otherwise, if your domain is as long as, how long is this one? That's pretty long, and then putting a few characters at the end. This isn't really a URL Shortener service anymore. So definitely get a domain that's as short as you can. And you'd be able to actually generate short URLs. So that's about it for this video. Covered a lot. Just as a bit of review, we started with sort of setting up our Dart Frog project, getting Docker installed, getting Postgres, our PG admin tool, Postman, and right at the end there we just set up our Heroku account. We installed all of our things and created our configuration using .env, connected to Postgres using the Postgres Dart package. And we made our link model. We did our link database table. We set up some CR. We didn't do anything for updating, deleting, but in theory you could do that. And we created those lovely endpoints for creating and retrieving and listing. And then we set up that redirect using the HTTP redirect option that we can do. We set up some click tracking, custom shortcodes, and then the idea of reusing a link if it already existed in the system. And lastly, we just set up our Docker file in CloudDB, and we got it going. Now the last piece of this would really be, how do you integrate with this now? We've built this pretty basic API. You'd probably want to build a Flutter app to go with it, or it could be really anything. This is an API. When I built this previously for this purpose of this video, but also for something I needed, I actually built a Python integration with basically the same code here, and it worked really well, and it allows me still to sort of control access on the back end, to talk to this thing, and everything was good. So it's a RESTful API. You can kind of do what you want with it, but for the purposes of this, I think showing it in Postman is more than enough, because you can obviously, if you're familiar with Flutter, you're familiar with anything, you can hit an endpoint with a post request and actually get back this data, parse it. That is not really in the scope of what we're doing now, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.